For today's class, we'll be looking at database security, and just before we look at it, I would like two volunteers to tell us about database administrators. What are their duties and what are the tools that you looked at while you were doing the research online? We will have a lady and we will have a gentleman. Should I choose, or we are all able to?
Things of choosing, let me close. If the meeting.
Yes, Benjamin, let's start with you. Yes, Benjamin. Has it gone off? Okay. Simon, what did you identify as the role of different database administrators? Simon Katende.
Good morning, madam.
Good morning.
I identified one of the duties of a database administrator is to install and configure the database.
Okay.
Data integrity.
Mm-hmm.
Backing up and data recovery, ensuring database accessibility, and he also carries out validation and checks on the data in the database.
When you talk about validation, what do you mean?
Making sure that the data in the database it has been the data that has been the data that has been loaded into a database is in its right format. If it's a phone number, it is in the right format of the phone number. If it is okay, like the logic of the data is proper.
Okay, thank you very much. Sheena? Sheena, what did you find out?
A database administrator decides the content of the database. They decide what data is going to be used in the database. They decide the hardware that is going to be used for the database. They decide the content of the database, like the fields, data types, domains. Then they're responsible for installing the database. They have to be there when it's being implemented, when it's loading into the system. Yeah, that's what I got.
Just a quick clarification. Do they decide the data that should be there, or that is already decided for them? They just make sure that they capture the right data. Which of that two? Do they have control of the data that should be there, or they ensure that they capture what the users want? Sheena?
They capture what the users want.
Okay, so if you remember, we talked about the data administrator, and the slight difference between the two is the data admin is in charge of the data. In other words, these are the people in an organization who know what data the organization has to store, and they also know who should access which piece of data. And therefore, this information is what is passed on to the database administrator to implement those rules and regulations. So yes, they ensure what the user wants. In this case, whatever has been defined for them by the different users as well as the data administrator, they now need to ensure that they implement it so that whatever goes into the database is valid within the restrictions provided by the users as well as the data administrator. Of course, this is together with the different procedures in terms of policies that are in the organization. So all this help to define what should be within the database. Okay, so let's look at this that you discovered. I will also pick at random. So I will ask Gloria to go first, and then Abel will go next. Gloria.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
The tools used by the database administrators, one tool is MySQL.
Yes.
Another tool is MySQL Server.
Okay.
And then Oracle RDBMS. That's what I got.
Okay. What do you think is common about the three that you've given us?
What is common about all the three is that they are all used by those database administrators too.
Interesting. Okay, Abel, go at it, and then we have a brief discussion.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, some of the tools used by database administrators include SQL, then PHP-admin, Oracle SQL Developer, and SQL Plus, among others.
Okay, I'll ask you the same question I asked Gloria. What's common about these three?
I think what's common among the three is that they simplify the work of database administrators through helping them develop those databases, maintaining them, and making changes easily.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'll just like you to take note that some of these are standalone tools that may be attached to a DBMS, but you realize most of the examples that you found out, like MySQL, Oracle, SQL Server, these are already database management systems. So ideally, in a database management system, as we looked at last week, it comprises of different modules or softwares that are put together to enable certain functionalities. So it is important to note that out there you will have database management systems that can be used as a DBA tool or a data administration tool, but there are also other tools that are not necessarily DBMSs, but provide additional functionality to the DBMS that you have. And so we can be able to take note of those two categories. I will go through the assignment which has come in, and I'll be able to put in my comments therein. Thank you, everybody, and I would like us now to start our class for today, unless there are questions that need us to respond to. Any questions? Yes, Godfrey also mentions that a DBA provides privileges. So he assigns the rights to the different users within the database environment. Thank you very much. So going straight to today's lecture. So today we will be looking at database security. And the first question I would like to ask each one of us is, we can respond in the chat, is, do you think it is of importance? Is database security something that is valid, relevant? Mercy, do you think it is of importance? Yes, it is important. Tabitha says. Mercy says yes. And so does Agnes. And so we agree that database security is important. The reason being is that we all can agree that data is one of those aspects within an organization, or it is, data is important. It has different roles it plays in terms of decision making. It helps to give you an advantage against your different competitors. And so it is a valuable resource. And if it is something of value needs to be protected. And when we're looking at database security, we want to be able to provide an environment in which we keep our data in a secure manner. And we'll be looking at what are the different aspects that enable us to tell or to ensure that the data we have is secure. So whether the information part of it is strategic, we have to keep it secure because it is of important value within the organization. Reason being is, even if your data falls in the hands of an unauthorized person, you may have, you will undergo aspects of loss if they steal it. And for example, if it was a formula for coming up with a specific drink, imagine if Coca-Cola lost its recipe for making Coca-Cola, it means it will start making losses. And that means it will have lost its profits. On the other hand, we are saying it's important to keep it secure because we want to ensure that you can access it whenever you need it. And therefore, we have to put measures within the environment to ensure that you don't lose availability or the ability to access your data, even as you do your operation. So it is important to note that security does not only apply to the data itself, but to all other parts that we looked at within the database management system environment. And that's why we had to look at it again. In other words, secure the hardware, secure the software, even the people as well as the data, including the procedures that you have. All these aspects should have security at the center of them to ensure that your database is actually secure. That you may put all the rules and regulations, but if you do not keep your server in a locked physical location, it means that the hardware can easily be stolen, and that means also your database is gone, it is vulnerable. So it's important to take note that security covers all aspects of the DBMS environment that we studied last week. So here we are saying, in addition to all that we have said before, database security provides one, control. Control, in other words, you want to ensure that we know who is accessing the data, what they can do with the data, and at the end of the day, can we be able to preserve the quality of the data? Somebody talked about the data remaining valid, and this comes back to the aspect of data quality. And therefore, to ensure this, we have different mechanisms that help us to guard against any threat. When we talk about a threat, it could be an event or a situation where you have an adverse effect on the system, an unwanted situation, something that grossly affects the operations. It could be the accessibility of the data, you no longer access it, and so that is a threat. Or it could be a threat in such a way that the data is being tapped into and accessed by unauthorized members. And therefore, that too is a threat to the database data that you have. And so when we look at the different aspects that cause threats, we look at 5 things with regards to data that can happen. 1, it could be stolen. And when it is stolen, it's not necessarily changed, but we are just saying it has fallen in hands of people who shouldn't have it. And most times, if a thief came to your house and took your property, it means they can sell it off, or they can actually blackmail you for you to get it back. So theft and fraud is one of the areas that database security should seek to avoid. We have the aspect of confidentiality. And when we talk about confidentiality, we are simply talking about how can we keep our data secret from an outsider. In other words, ensure that only authorized users can actually access the data. So if you lose confidentiality, it means your data has been accessed or it has been tapped into by an unauthorized user. The other aspect we need to guard against is loss of privacy. These days, it is a great debate with the increase in technologies and AI and big data aspects. The issue of privacy is really one of those aspects. Asking ourselves, is it possible to actually keep our data private? and you can read more about this. But when we talk about privacy, we are simply saying, can the identity of the individuals involved in the data be kept secure? In other words, I know by university, let me call it an institution, where the recordings of their classes are not shared. Reason being, they're not sure of what the students are going to do with that particular recording. And because it's not edited, their chances are, one, their privacy is going to be lost. That means you can identify somebody through the voice. Each one of us has a distinct voice that can be used for identifying who you are. And therefore, they are stingy, they are careful is the word. They are careful to ensure that they can protect the identity of their facilitators to an extent by passing a policy that no, any online recording, unless edited, is not going to be shared. So you either attend the class and take your notes, or you lose out and just work with the reading material that is provided for. So that's an aspect of privacy. And this is very key, especially when we come to medical data, because we all know that people are very careful about sharing their health status with others, because you don't want to bring aspects of stigmatization. So privacy is important, and it is about the identity of individuals involved in the data. Compared to confidentiality, we are saying confidentiality is just ensuring that the whole set of data does not fall in the hands of unauthorized users. We have integrity, and this is the aspect of data whereby we want it to remain in the format it should be in before it's updated, or even after it has been updated. The rules and regulations that govern the data should remain. So when we talk about loss of integrity, we are simply saying that the data has gotten to be invalid, or it has gotten to be corrupt. And therefore, database security seeks to ensure that we don't corrupt the data or make it invalid. We also look at availability, ensuring that we don't lose it. And that I have explained, it's about being able to access your data. There are threats such as denial of service. This is where a malicious person sends a lot of code or a lot of work to the database to clog it. And therefore you as the authorized user fails to be able to access the system. And therefore that means you can't do your work, you will make losses and blah, blah, blah. Imagine this happened to a banking system where the users can't be able to access their bank statements, they can't access their accounts. It would be a really great security threat for the bank. And you'll also have different customers suing the bank because of such a threat. So we are saying that these situations are very important for us to look at. In other words, the different aspects we have looked at, that is keeping it away from fraud and theft, keeping their confidentiality, privacy, integrity, and availability. And the goal of database security is to reduce the risk or the possibility of these things happening. And therefore, you need to be able to know sometimes when you lose confidentiality, you may as well have lost your privacy. So some of these aspects are intertwined. In other words, if you lose, you can also lose data, and at the same time, they have not only stolen, but made it invalid or corrupted it. So integrity has also been lost. So it is important to critically look at these different areas and set security measures as you develop your different database applications to ensure that you have a secure environment. So the reasons as to why such threats arise, it could be that in your design, you didn't cater for the security aspect. And so whether you're designing the network, what kind of tools do you need to put in place? Are they firewalls? Are they VPNs? If you're using cloud computing, what exactly should you put in place to ensure security? So right from the design of the network as well as the application, you need to put security at the core. Some of us take long to update our systems, and this can also be a source of threats to your database. So keep your versions up to date. The configurations, ensure that you have configurations in the system that ensure that security is paramount. It could be malicious acts by an insider or an outsider. So one of the things is to keep your staff motivated to ensure that they don't indulge in any malicious act. Because imagine, the English say keep your friend close, but your enemy closer. Reason being, we don't want to be caught unawares. So one of the ways to keep monitoring and ensuring that all the measures that you put in place are working is what we refer to periodic audits. In other words, go look at your logs to be able to know whether there are vulnerabilities. You've heard of ethical hackers. Some organizations actually hire ethical hackers. These are people who try to break into the system with purpose of looking at the loopholes to ensure that they can be able to block those vulnerable places. So periodic audits are very important when it comes to database security, with the purpose of identifying one, the anatomy of the attack. In other words, how did it start? What is its origin? What did the person actually do? In one of the scams that is out there is where you receive an email that is asking you to either click on a certain link, and that link has malicious code. If you click on it, all of a sudden, even the documents on your laptop or in your system get encrypted. So you need to be able to understand, how did this attacker arrive in order for you to guard against them? What are the possible ways they can approach the system? So phishing is just a way of users trying to find more information that they actually should have in order to use it to attack you. Others will ask you questions, legit questions, for you to give away your passwords, codes, or something like that. And then you end up being a victim of an attack. So DBAs always look out to understand the anatomy of different possible attacks. And once they have understood the different ways attacks can come in, then they take steps to secure the database, as you already read. And this is during the design as well as the configuration of the system, as our colleagues mentioned at the beginning of the class. Finally, the other key aspect is to come up with a security strategy to make sure that you have planned for how to secure the network, secure the application, and secure all the other components in the DBMS environment. I've already mentioned what a threat is. It could be something that is tangible or intangible. Or in an example of intangible is where you lose the confidence of your customers, you lose their your credibility. Now, others they say, you can't trust Mercury because they keep breaking into their systems, and so you can't even trust what you got. So that is why it is important to ensure that we keep our systems secure so that the people out there can hold, do not doubt the data that you have or your credibility. So different, when we are putting measures, we need to know that considerable amount of time and effort should be spent on strategizing on how you're going to ensure that your database is secure and all the environment components. And that is why, as I mentioned, some organizations take up an extra employee as an ethical hacker. Their job is just to keep on seeking different ways how their system can be broken into with one intention. How do we ensure that people out there don't actually break into? And that's why time and effort plus money are investments that need to be put in when it comes to database security. So examples of threats, one is where we have people who have lots of privileges misusing them. And I am sure you can give me examples of this. They may not be related to the database, but one common, there is a time in Mercury where there was a system user, or actually I think an administrator, who was getting paid by students to change marks. That means this person had the right to be able to access the data, and he misused it for the benefit. One, he was getting money, but also students were passing, if I may use that word. They were paying off their retakes instead of actually working to pass. So it is one of the things that in your strategy, you would cater for. And that's why many organizations have more than one person accountable in a process. You don't leave it to one person to be the judge as well as the prosecutor and the jury. No. You make sure you have one set who can judge, one set approves, and the other can be able to implement or accuse or do the discipline. So you set your organization in such a way that you have more than one person accountable for the data, just to avoid the misuse of privileges. We have the SQL injection. These are attacks that are carried out by inserting malicious statements into the application. And these are common, and so it is important for us to take note and say, you can do more research on how people actually inject an SQL statement into your web application in order to gain access into your systems. The other aspect is about poor auditing records. I mentioned that one of the strategies in database security is to perform periodic audits, but you can't do an audit if you don't have records. In other words, you're not tracking every single activity that is taking place in the system. Who accessed it? What time did they access it? What particular data item did they access, and what changes did they make? What was the original? So if you keep record of all this information during audits, you'll be able to note flags where an irregularity actually happened. So most application developers need to take note of, sure that they actually keep audit logs or log files or whatever is happening in the system, mainly for purposes of auditing. And you can actually put aspects such as triggers that if anything happens, there is a flag that is sent out to the administrator to take note, or is somebody who tried to put malicious code into the system, and then you can quickly go and address it. We have malware and we have storage media exposure. Malware is usually, most times during phishing, it could be in an email and you click on a particular link that sends a piece of code to disorganize your system. Sometimes they will encrypt. I remember once all my Word files became applications, and so I could not access them anymore. So it is important to take note, and these spread very fast. The storage the storage media exposure. This is an attack that gets where an attacker gets access to your unencrypted backups. So it's important to back up your work, but ensure it's encrypted, especially for sensitive data. This still goes back to your strategy that you have set in place. I've mentioned about the denial of service, where we are hindering the accessibility of the system by overloading it with so many requests. And once you overload it, even those who actually should be using the system fail to access it. And so they are denied accessibility or service by the system. So it is important to keep, that's why you have network administrators who keep on checking the traffic to be able to know who is accessing, is it the right numbers, or there's a possibility of actually somebody trying to overload the servers with requests. And so you need to look into it. So this is just a diagrammatic representation of the various threats and how they deal with the different aspects of the DBMS in environment, the hardware, the software, the people involved. What are the different possible threats you can have under this? This should be available in your chapter extract that is on Mwele, and be able to read further on each of these. And therefore, at the end of the day, we are saying database security has one goal. And this goal is very broad. One, it affects every component within the database environment, but we want to be able to ensure that we maintain or guard against any compromise which could lead to the loss of 1, confidentiality, 2, integrity, and 3, availability. So those are the 3 broad aspects of database security that we need to always pay attention to. Of course, we talked about privacy. Initially, this has been clumped together with confidentiality. So one of those common things when you are reading about database security is the acronym CIA, which just stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So before I go forward, are there any questions or clarifications that you would like to seek? Anyone? Okay. So as we define what security is, we are saying security, database security is protection of your database against the loss of CIA. And when we talk about protection, we look at it in threefold. 1, can we prevent these losses? 2, if they happen, are we able to actually detect that it has happened? And this is done through the auditing that we have spoken about. We go back to the logs of what has been happening and try to mine or to dig out, to look for unusual patterns within the logs. And as soon as we find something unusual, it's usually a trigger to know that something fishy or there was a security breach. And having detected, are we able to recover from it? And therefore we are saying the last arm of protecting your database is by having the ability to recover from any kind of threat that may have occurred. And therefore it is important, as I mentioned, to keep your backups as secure as you would keep your database itself, because we make use of the backups as well as the transaction log files. We will look at an in-depth view of what a transaction log file is when we're looking at transaction management. And therefore, database security, as I have mentioned, looks at features or mechanisms or measures that can be put in place to ensure we don't lose these 3 aspects. We don't lose confidentiality, which we've combined with privacy. We do not lose integrity of the data, which encompasses around the quality, the validity, the accuracy of your data, and the availability of your system. And as you noticed when you were looking or researching about different tools, you noticed that the database management systems that we have in place have these inbuilt in them. At least they take into consideration taking audit logs, or what we're referring to as system logs. They have that capability of doing this. So your job as a DBA is to be able to configure it right such that you can take records and use those records for analysis purposes or audit purposes to detect any fraud. We also have inbuilt mechanisms within the DBMS to ensure that we can prevent as much threat as possible. And that is where someone talked about granting of privileges. This is a functionality provided. We also have the aspect of business rules, constraints, all this to guard the integrity of the data, and also performance aspects that we mentioned in our research. So all this, most of our DBMSs in place at the moment provide the functionality. So what you need to do is to configure your system well enough to ensure that it is secure. I mentioned what confidentiality is and what privacy is. And we are saying if we lose confidentiality, most times we are affecting the competitiveness of an organization because your data has gone to, for example, your competitor. So the question is, and when we talk about competition, we are simply saying there has to be that one thing that makes you better than the other. So what do you offer that is different from your colleague? If both of you are producing a drink, the question is, what makes my drink much better than your drink? It simply means the recipe. There could be the same ingredients that I use, but how I do it makes a difference. And so I need to do as much as possible to protect the how, the method I follow in order to come up with that product. So it is the same thing when we are looking at any organization. That competitive advantage must be protected. It could be in the services provided or the systems that you use are flexible, they are agile, they enable you to provide good customer service and quick service. So if anyone would attack that tool, look at the system as a tool, and cause you to delay in providing services, that means you have lost your competitiveness. Privacy, I already mentioned this, is when the identity of a person is lost. Okay. My only challenge with the hand that went up is that you've used student numbers, registration numbers. I can't identify you by this, so I will kindly request you to rename yourselves to your official names that I can work with, such that we can have a class that that works for us. Otherwise, I would also decide to put an acronym for my name. So let's use our names even as we attend class. Okay, so some countermeasures that are in place to ensure that we have confidentiality and privacy. One measure is known as authentication. This is very common, and I'm sure you have interacted with it before. It's just a mechanism of determining who a user is. In other words, are you who you claim to be? And so many people have used usernames and passwords, the combination to be able to identify a given user. I'd like to ask us which other kind of authentication measures you have interacted with in the course of your life, apart from usernames and passwords. You can use the chat or you can put up your hand. What other authentication measures have you come across? And there was silence in the class. Okay, thank you. Sylvia says biometrics. Biometrics is quite a large word, but Elisa says we have the digital signature, we have the fingerprint, not the scanner, but the fingerprints, which falls under biometrics. We have digital signatures, yes. Which other biometrics do we have? We have the iris scanner. I would like, okay, so you can use the iris, you can use voice, you can use face. All these fall within biometrics. Biometrics simply means we look at something biological about an individual. Systems even look at the locomotion of a particular user to be able to identify a user. Okay, so that is all about authentication. And the point here is, can we be sure that you are who you claim to be? The reason why I'm saying in this facial recognition measures, some people do different, what are they called? Plastic surgery. Aspects about you that can never change. And so if they can be able to formulate your initial structure of your face, that means we can be able to say that, yeah, this is Mercy. Doesn't matter how much she has tried to change, make her nose longer, or her eyes more slim. I don't know, because I have large eyes. For whatever reason, they should be able to identify particular features on your face that can enable you to be identified. So those are the different countermeasures that you can put to help us to authenticate a user. The other aspect is authorization, and this is in line with what one of us mentioned, is that we don't stop at just ensuring that we know that you are who you say you are, but we also would like to know what you can be able to do. So authorization comes into place to grant you a right or a privilege to enable you to perform a particular task within the system or within the database. In other words, are we able to restrict what you can do? Because you remember one of the threats we mentioned is when somebody has excessive rights and therefore they can easily use them to manipulate the system and therefore cause losses within the system. So here in authorization, it's about granting of privileges, and one of the ways is to have the access control through privileges, granting and revoking. There has to be, the DBA should be able to do this, as we mentioned above. An important thing that I would like us to be able to read about And this falls within both these countermeasures for confidentiality purposes is the multi-layered authentication. Read about multi-layered authentication. It will be our starting point of discussion. Multi-layered authentication. Okay, so when we talk about authorization, the rights can be given to the whole database itself, or you can be given rights to only but a portion of the database. And this is a summary of different levels of privileges that you can actually have. This will be practically gone through by Dr. Ndivatia when he comes over to have a lecture with you on database security. We will look at practically going through the granting and the revoking of privileges. So I put here the code that helps us to do this, but I will skip it and it will be handled by Dr. Ndivatia. The other measure, we have looked at authentication, authorization, but there's also what we refer to as a view. A view is a restricted, you can look at it as a virtual window into different tables within a database that you can be able to look in and do some little manipulation depending on the kind of view you have. And therefore, I will still mention it here, but we would like to look at it practically to see how to create it, how I will relate it, so to help us to understand is, if you remember the 3-leveled architecture of the database, we said we have the first layer being an external view, where we define what different user views should see, what each user category should be able to see. And this is implemented using views, where you define what exactly each category should be able to view or to see or interact within the database, and not everything. And so I will leave this to be handled practically as well. All I want you to know at the moment is it's one of the countermeasures, and we will look at it practically. That's just code, and I will skip it as well. I mentioned you can be able to update the tables which you are viewing through a view, but there are different characteristics or rules that need to be satisfied. This again, we need to cover it practically so that it can settle in our minds. So I will skip it as well. The last countermeasure that we will look at is encryption. Remember, we said confidentiality is about ensuring that we do not have unauthorized users falling in getting a hold of our data. So one of the ways is by ensuring that whether they fall into it, they don't make sense out of our data. And so one of the ways is by encoding the data. So there's a special algorithm that you can run over the data to ensure that it is presented or kept in a manner that, unless you have the key to unlock or to decrypt the data, to move it from a coded version to plain text, you can't be able to access that data. So we have different kinds of techniques that help us to encrypt the data. And these fall into two broad categories: the reversible and the irreversible. The reversible bad states is that you cannot be able to change once you encrypt. And then we have the reversible, that you can go back and forth between the plain text and the encoded data. And this is common where you want to be able, especially where there is data sharing. We don't want data to be transferred from point A to point B, and along the way, we have issues of eavesdropping and so on and so forth. So we don't want it to move and when it is not encrypted. So this is another measure that is in play for confidentiality. Okay. I would like to touch on integrity, and then we will take a break and possibly come back after lunch to look at the last aspect of availability. So when we look at integrity, we are simply saying that we want data to remain valid. Data remaining valid, that simply means, one, it is in its expected format, and even the values they are in can be trusted. That means they are accurate. That whatever I have and whatever the other user is accessing is the same. That's why we're saying internal data and external data should actually be the same. It should be correct. That simply means it stays in the right state, in the same state, before it is modified by any transaction. And even though it is modified, the rules that govern the data should always be satisfied. And once they are satisfied, then we will be able to say that that data is valid. We will go in depth to look at other characteristics of data within data quality that will go a step further to help us to understand much more about data integrity. But these three are the most common and the most important that are out there or commonly referred to: the validity, the accuracy, and the correctness of the data. So the countermeasures that have been put in place are both at entity level, and here we are trying to ensure that every data item within a database can be uniquely identified. Once that identity has been changed, it means that data is different and therefore either corrupted or has been modified. And so there are rules that are set to ensure that each row or data item in a table is kept within or is kept in a particular format. In other words, we do not want to have two students within ACMIS who are identified by the same number because you are different. And we don't want your number to be changed anyhow. And therefore, we are saying that entity integrity as a constraint is set to ensure that we don't have duplicate records in the system and that we can actually uniquely identify each record. And therefore, you can never have null values. There is no student in Makerere University who does not have a registration number, and there is none that does not have a student number, because these are values or attributes that are kept unique and we cannot have nothing for you because they need to identify you as an individual within the system. And within the system, this number is what identifies you. So we have to protect that. So that is one of the countermeasures to keep your integrity, such that if there is a change, even of one figure in your student number, we automatically think you're dealing with somebody else and not necessarily Mercy, if Mercy is the individual in question. We have referential integrity. This comes into play where we have references between different data items. We are simply saying, and this is commonly known as a foreign key, and I'm sure you interacted with it in DIM 1, whereby if there is a relationship, for example, between a student and the next of kin, we are simply saying that within the next of kin table, your student number should remain the same as that one identifying you in the student table. Reason being, you must first exist as a student before we keep information about your next of kin. So we are simply saying that if you have a foreign key within your table, the value it holds must match the value in the record it is referring to. Otherwise, we will not have a value. For example, if you didn't supply your next of kin, we don't expect to have a value connecting you to any individual within the next of kin table. About business integrity constraints, that aspect, we are saying there are different rules that not necessarily are attached to the entity or the relationship between different data items, but these are constraints that are defined by an organization. And how we implement this is commonly through triggers and stored procedures. Through triggers and stored procedures. In other words, you write a piece of code or a script that enables you to define the rules that say, I'll get an example. No student should be able to get an examination permit unless they have paid fully. That simply means you can't do your exams if you haven't paid fully because you don't have an exam permit that can be printed. If the rules were, well, you can sit for exams if you have paid, say, 60%. So we are simply saying that trigger is written in such a way that as long as a student has 60% payment, they are allowed to print out an exam permit. However, they may not sit for all exams. The registrar should be able to define how many exams you can sit for. So those are rules and policies that organizations have that need to be implemented in the system. And we said we come up with those pieces of code. They're either stored procedures or triggers. And these two are things that will be looked at in your practical class. Implementation of triggers and procedures, implementation of views. We want to look at user management in terms of creating a user and granting privileges as well as revoking, and to an extent, you will also look at encryption. So in your practical class, please take note of these, and these are pointers of what will be handled practically in database security as a topic. Questions with regards to integrity and confidentiality. Any questions with regards to integrity and confidentiality? Okay, since I don't see questions, the last part of this, I think we will cover it when we meet again in the afternoon at 3. We'll take a few minutes, to be like an hour or less, to look at availability. So for now, you can go for your lunch and come back then. Is that okay? All right, so see you then.